Have your attention, please. Have your attention. Would you please turn the music off? Thank you very much.
Oh, that's better.
My name is Phil Rico. I'm the mayor of the city of Trinidad. I want to welcome everyone today to this event. This is a good crowd. Thank you for your attendance. I just want to let you know that we do have some people from out of town that I want to welcome them. We have the people from Idaho Springs. We have the mayor. We have the mayor. We have the mayor from Starkville. We also have the, let's see, well, someone here from Pueblo. I'm not sure what your position is. Okay. We also have Lahana. And is there anyone else from out of the city of Trinidad? Gunnison. Walsenburg. Lakewood. Excellent turnout, excellent turnout. An intern as well. So you guys have come from all over the state to this, and thank you for that, dear. You know, the interest in historical preservation is really important, and we also have really a very person I think everybody knows, Miss Dana Crawford, with us here tonight. You know, history is so important to all of us. We all live in historical communities in our state. A lot of our buildings are dilapidated. They need a lot of work. As you well know, Trinidad is one of them. We have 80 plus buildings right in the downtown area that need preservation, and we've been working diligently to try to make that happen. So this is very well worth our time and your time to be here to kind of get an understanding as to what we can do for our communities to help build that preservation. So it's really, really important that we're all here. And I'll turn this over to Tara here in a minute, but I wanted to thank History Colorado for the funding that we received for this program this evening. I also want to thank our historical preservation group. Would our members from our historical preservation group please stand up, please? Thank you for all the work that you do for us, and we'll keep going, and hopefully we can make some additional things happen. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Tara Marshall, who will finish this out. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you, Mayor Rico. My name is Tara Marshall. I'm the Development Services Director for the City of Trinidad. It is my honor to work with our Historic Preservation Commission, who you just recognized. They work very diligently to try and raise awareness for historic preservation within our community. We're so excited to have a regional event here, but I'm only here to do the introduction of Mr. Donovan Ripkema. Donovan is a premier historic preservationist who works in the practical side of historic preservation. He has an exciting presentation for us that talks about where historic preservation intersects in a very practical way with economic development, and really the value of using preservation methods in your community to create economic development activity. We want to thank Ms. Dana Crawford for helping us secure the speaker and using her help to get the Historic Preservation Commission the funds to do so. As the mayor stated, this program is funded by the State Historic Fund. So with no further ado, Mr. Donovan Ripkema.
Thanks,
Tara, and thank you all for coming out. This is one fabulous place here. I'm just really excited. I travel a lot. I spend 220 nights a year in hotel rooms, about 2/3 of it in the U.S., about 1/3 of it overseas, and in any given year, I'm in 100 towns and cities. This is a fabulous place. This is absolutely one incredible place, so thanks for having me. So here's where I got involved in historic preservation. This is the Buell Building on the corner of 7th and St. Joe in Rapid City, South Dakota, my hometown. And I did it out of sheer capitalist greed. I heard that there was some tax credits available, and the state historic preservation, I didn't have any money. I was a 30-year-old kid doing real estate appraisal for $50 an appraisal for the banks. And state historic preservation office said, hey, if we'd give you some money, would you buy that and rehab it? And I had zero money, but I said, yeah, I can give you some money. And then I borrowed way too much, but that's kind of the story. But this is how I got involved in historic preservation. A great a building that, of the vintage that could be in Trinidad. It was built between 1889 and 1890. So I did that, a number of years ago using tax credits. But in that process, I started going to National Trust Conference, National Trust for Historic Preservation. And the first one I went to was in New Orleans in 1981, I think. And at the last Saturday of the conference, in the morning, there was kind of an open mic session where anybody could go and say anything they want. And this is no exaggeration, that the whole audience was filled with people arguing you shouldn't be allowing real estate developers to come to this conference, that it's diminishing the quality of the preservation world. They shouldn't even be allowed to come to the conference. Well, I was one. And so, I thought, is this the place for me to be? Thank God that that's changed over the years, so that there's very enlightened developers around the country who are both strong supporters of the National Trust and of historic preservation, and the attitude of preservationists has changed, but it's dramatically different than it was 30, 40 years ago. And then what happened to me is I went to, like your city manager, I went to the University of South Dakota to get my degree, went back home, and I started doing this historic preservation stuff because I was in the real estate appraisal and small scale development business, but I didn't really know anything about historic preservation. So I took a mid-career break, went back to Columbia University in New York and got a master's degree in historic preservation. And I started surveying the literature to see what had been written about this connection between historic preservation and economics. And the answer was almost nothing. Almost nothing. So there's the only ones I could come up with. So I'm writing my thesis. Well, it's kind of good for me because I didn't have a long lit review because nobody had written anything about it. And my thesis was on the comparative cost of rehabilitation and new construction. So I'm reading this stuff and I stumble over what I've later called the myth of the 25 to 30%. And it was everywhere. Every time there was a mention of, including those 3 publications you saw, every time there was a mention of historic preservation and cost, it said, and rehabilitation of historic buildings is 25 to 30% cheaper than new construction. And I thought, well, where did that come from? Where did that come from? So I started digging. Well, lo and behold, it came from, in the late 70s, Dana Crawford and the Urban Land Institute held a conference in Seattle, I think, right, about preservation stuff, and a bunch of papers and presentations made. And one guy, a developer from Portland, said, well, in a couple of our projects, we seem to be, maybe we were 25, 30% less than new building. And then and that's where it came from. And so then I'm doing my thesis, and I had the fortune to meet Dana. So I'm, writing my thesis in New York. I called up Dana, and I said, what is this 25 to 30% thing? She said, yeah. She said, so this guy's Portland developer says that, and I'm wrapping up the conference and she said, and among the presentations we heard is one developer found he could do things for 25 to 30% cheaper than new construction, and that took on a life of its own. And literally for 25 years, it was just like an imaginary thing, but it took on a real life. Well, then there started to be real systematic analysis of the economic impact of historic preservation. And 2 early studies paid for by the National Trust, but done at the city level in Galveston, Texas, and Fredericksburg, Virginia, and looked at kind of some data. And then I went to Columbia University and I learned I loved cities, and so instead of going back to South Dakota, which had been my intention, I said, I just love big cities, and so I moved to Washington to kind of set up a consulting practice. I didn't exactly know what it was. And I decided that, and I'm really not a very competitive person, and here were all of these preservationists, all of whom talked about real estate, none of whom knew anything about real estate. And so I thought, ooh, maybe that's a little niche for me. And I've really kind of often viewed my career, such as it is, as that as a kind of translator between the world of economics and real estate and the world of historic preservation. So if you'd asked me to identify the difference between a Queen Anne and a High Victorian, I don't know what the hell I do. That's not my piece of this whole preservation stuff. Well, there were those two early studies, and I have to warn you that I'm a numbers geek guy, and you're going to suffer, is all I can tell you. You're going to suffer at the endless economics symposium, I'm just telling you. Well, in the last 20 years, a little over 20, in fact, there have been a number of economic studies of the impact of historic preservation, most of which have been on the state level. Two very good. When my firm has done maybe half of them. David Listican at Rutgers has done a handful of them. Clarion, a very, very good firm with offices in Chicago and Denver, has done two studies here in Colorado, just excellent studies. So we began to amass a kind of body of information. And then in the last 3 years, we have done I think we've finished 6, and there are 2 more done studies at the city level on the impact of historic preservation. And I'd like to say that's because I'm so smart and saw that as a little special market. That wasn't it at all. It was smart clients, potential clients who said, you know, the state data is fine, but in fact, the ones that can really affect what happens to historic preservations are mayors and city council members and local bankers. And they need to know what's happening in our town, not at the state level. And so in the last, just a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, we've done citywide studies in Pittsburgh and Raleigh, in Savannah and San Antonio in New York City. We just last week turned in our final drafts of citywide studies in Miami-Dade County and in Indianapolis. I came here from Los Angeles. We're starting a study on the impact of historic preservation in Los Angeles, and next month start one in a small town that we're excited about, Saratoga Springs, New York. So there's a lot of the data is from what we've learned in recent years. What's happened, the reason we can do this now, the change from what was true 20 years ago. A couple of things. One is the availability of big data. You can get data, get numbers from stuff. Second is the ability to convert that data, that numerical data, into visual representation through the GIS system. Now, the third piece is I've finally figured out how to hire smart young people. I don't even know what GIS stands for, but I got 3 of the smart young women who do, and so we use that to look at this data, and we'll show you some of that. Well, stepping back over these studies over the last 25 years, regardless of who does it, my firm, somebody else's firm, Clarion, Listigan, usually the big 4 emerge. And that is the role of historic preservation in downtown revitalization efforts. That usually means Main Street programs, but not always. The incremental difference in heritage tourism, the jobs and household income generated by the act of rehabilitating historic buildings, and the impact on property values of local historic districts. And in some of these statewide studies, there might be 1 or 2 things added on, but those have really been the core. And so in our recent studies, we've certainly looked at those big 4, and I'll give you some examples. So on the downtown revitalization study, we are big fans of Main Street, and I'm thrilled that Trinidad's a Main Street community, because it is the singular, most effective, cost-effective form of economic development that there is, period, no exception. Not downtown revitalization, any kind of economic development, extraordinarily cost-effective. And in the last few years, we have done studies in 6 states of the state Main Street programs over their lifetime impact. One of those was in Florida. Florida has had a program for about 25 years, almost 30. The state program, taxpayers of Florida have provided over that 30 years about $6 million to support that program. The private sector investment in those Main Street communities, 1.4 billion with a B. So it's one of those things where very relatively small public commitment at the state level paid giant dividends. Here's the kind of typical cost, program cost, about $300,000 a year program in the state of Florida. Just the sales tax from not all the businesses in the Main Street communities, from the net new businesses, generate $3.5 million worth of sales tax for the state, 10 times, just in that piece, 10 times of what that program is costing them. One of the smart things that Main Street did when they began is require that local Main Street managers keep track of stuff. And what's really nice is that now you have 30 or 35 years worth of data in some cases of what's happened. And among the numbers that a local Main Street manager is required to keep is the number of net new businesses and net new jobs. And that means net. There's going to be businesses that close. And so that Main Street manager said, hey, we had a new store open and they had 3 employees, but one closed and had 4. So this month we had negative job growth of 1, whatever. Well, over the 25 years in Iowa Main Street, which is one of the really great programs in the country, almost 12,000 net new jobs. Most of those towns, the vast majority of towns in the Iowa Main Street program are the size of Trinidad or smaller, and yet 12,000 net new jobs, and nearly 4,000 net new businesses. One other connection between those two numbers is if you say number of net new jobs, number of net new businesses, you see that average business size is 3 people or 4 people. Well, that really is the kind of, doesn't mean that there's never a 200 person firm that opens up on Main Street, but mostly it's small local businesses, and that has huge impact on all kinds of grounds as it goes forward. Here is North Carolina. Again, one of the very early Main Street programs, had a very good program for a number of years. And here is the year-to-year job change in the state of North Carolina versus what happens in the Main Street communities. And the North Carolina is the pink line. You see that almost every year, the Main Street communities are at or above the job growth than the state. But look at what happens in recession. And look at 2009 and 2010 in particular. Here, the state dumped jobs, as most states around the country did, not those Main Street communities, because they created an economic environment in those downtowns around historic preservation that both keeps businesses alive when things are tough, and in fact makes people interested in opening up there where they might not open up in other places. And this is a consistent pattern every place we've looked at. In New Mexico, again, New Mexico is one of my favorite states, and as you all know in this part of Colorado, is that while there's a kind of alley of prosperity in between Santa Fe and Albuquerque, most of New Mexico are rural towns and not wealthy towns. And that's what constitutes most of the New Mexico Main Street programs. But it doesn't matter that they are doing great, so they have seen $500 million in these little towns, $500 million in investment in those places. In Michigan, again, a state like Michigan suffers economically. All relatively new Main Street program, 10 years old when we did the study, and nearly all small, really small towns. And yet 250 buildings have been sold in those places. That would be a state where Trinidad's data would really boost up their overall returns, but in these small towns it's great news. But it's not all just Main Street. Here's the city of Raleigh. And Raleigh is in the Research Triangle. It's the state capital of North Carolina. It's in the midst of Duke and North Carolina State, Wake Forest, so it's a big concentration of universities. So it's a region that's really rapidly growing, and that includes downtown Raleigh. And lots of real quality new construction, nobody's against that. But where are the new businesses opening up in Raleigh? Well, nearly half of them opened up in historic buildings. And another quarter of them, of the new businesses, opened up in older buildings that just hadn't been declared historic yet. So it's this appeal to start up small and startup businesses that are really important. I'd argue that those are the real important part of economic development. I don't care what the big guys say. Economic development is trickle up, not trickle down. You don't get some big white knight and then everything happens. Amazon's giant thing notwithstanding. It really is at the other end. It's a little stuff grows, and because that one grew a little, the one next door can survive, and that's clearly what's happening here. We've started to look at alternative data sources. And so when we were doing this project in Raleigh, we looked at Yelp, who the favorite restaurants were in Raleigh on Yelp. Well, lo and behold, half of them were in historic buildings. Well, what's that saying? It's not just the food. It's the character of where you're eating, like the great place we're going to eat tonight, right? It's the character of the place that adds the character, the reason, the attraction, the pull of that place. Here is Savannah, one of the great, of course, historic cities in America. Wonderful place. About 30% of all of the jobs in Savannah are in the historic districts. But half of the small firm jobs, jobs of less than 10 people, and almost 60% of the jobs at startup firms are in the historic district. Again, it's that for startup businesses and small businesses, it's a character appeal that historic neighborhoods have. And then sometimes the data is narrative instead of numeric. With a great young guy who runs the downtown Pittsburgh partnership, the downtown equivalent of Trinidad's Main Street program. Historic preservation has been key to downtown's growth. Really understands that, and if you haven't been to Pittsburgh, you need to go. This is one of the fabulous Renaissance cities in America, and led by their downtown. And it's built into how they think about stuff in Pittsburgh. They don't even think we're doing historic preservation. They just say, hey, we're reinvesting in Pittsburgh, and overwhelmingly that's in historic buildings. So the first big one is downtown revitalization, and the role that plays most of my career in the last 35 years has dealt with downtown revitalization. Here's what I can tell you. While it varies in magnitude from places to places, I cannot identify a single sustained example of successful downtown revitalization that didn't have historic preservation as a key element of that strategy. Not one. I can give you plenty of examples of very expensive failures in downtown revitalization where historic preservation, the strategy was to get rid of those stupid old buildings. Just tell me. So the second area is heritage tourism. We're not tourism experts, and we don't always look at it, but sometimes it's really important. This is a study that we did not do, someone else did, but they looked at Philadelphia, the 5 counties around Philadelphia, at the heritage tourism portion of that. And you can see it, $3 billion in output, 45,000 jobs, almost $1 billion in earnings. But, Philadelphia is the cradle of American democracy. Not big numbers, not a surprise. Here is Arkansas. You don't jump out, that big historic Arkansas. And it's only 16% of the visitors there fall in the heritage tourism category, but they spend 30% more than other visitors, more likely to be from out of state, and that's really important. It's great, you go from here to Colorado Springs for a long weekend. Well, Colorado Springs, picks up some money, but there's no net change in the Colorado economy. You get change when there's somebody that crosses the border and spends their money. So a decidedly major difference in non-local visitors. Even this small share, 21,000 jobs, 319 million in income, and important for those of you in public service who have to figure out how to do the best with the tax you're collecting, $74 million in tax revenues. In Florida, again, we think about Florida, Disney World and the beaches and Gulf, and that's a big, and of course it's their biggest tourism industry, but even the tourists who go to Florida, and maybe for something else, 47% of them, in fact, went to historic sites while they were in Florida. We did a study in San Antonio. Of course, San Antonio has the Alamo, and San Antonio has recent entry on the World Heritage List of the missions of San Antonio. And we looked at what the tourism is. Well, the way we looked at it, that about 60% of the overnight visitors to San Antonio and a little short of half of the day visitors we categorized as heritage visitors. And later on, somebody wants to know what our methodology, I'll be happy to share that. So a big chunk of the visitors. But tourists spend their money on 5 things: on lodging, on local transportation, on food and beverage, on retail purchases, and on admissions, recreations, miscellaneous expenditures. This does not count the airplane ticket to get there, because you don't benefit from that, but it does count the Uber or the taxi or the local bus or whatever. In every one of those categories, every one of them, the heritage visitors spent more in San Antonio than did the other visitors. So they not only are there in big numbers, but each one of them is a more powerful economic driver than tourists in general. New York City, again, a gazillion reasons why people go to New York City, but a third of them, people coming just for the day, and 40% of them stay overnight. In fact, are categorized as heritage visitors. By the way, just FYI, about 60% of a tourist expenditure will be made in the place he or she stays overnight. Now, we like to have day visitors. They're great. We don't want to chase them away. But the real added value is when you have them that stay overnight. So when I heard earlier today thinking about extending events in Trinidad that have been 1-day to 2-day events. Well, that's a great strategy, because then you get that overnight real big increment in expenditures. So just the heritage visitor expenditure in New York City is $8 billion. And then that translates into tax revenues. So the city of New York is getting, 40,000 jobs and huge amounts of wages from that heritage share of their visitation. We just finished a study in Rhode Island, a very small state. Oh, thank you very much. What a good constituent focused mayor. So Rhode Island, little state, has a big beach business. And that's their biggest share is the beach visitation. But it's not unlike skiing in Colorado. It's real seasonal. And so they get the beach stuff for 3 months or maybe 3.5, and then it's kind of gone. The tourism, which is next to the beach activity for tourist activities, is the second, but it's stabilized because it's way more throughout the year. And $1.4 billion of economic activity in the state of Rhode Island, a tiny little state. Rhode Island tourism industry. By the way, Rhode Island and Trinidad have something in common. The governor has said that Trinidad has the greatest concentration of historic resources per capita in the nation or the whatever. Well, Rhode Island as a state has the greatest concentration, the highest number of National Register listed buildings per square mile of any state in the nation. The U.S. government does some things stupid, but some things right, and among the things they do is they survey inbound tourists to the United States who come by plane. And that eliminates the kind of daily crossovers from Mexico and Canada. So if you're getting on a plane coming to the U.S., you're serious about what you're doing. They have a category called cultural tourists. Definitions in the tourism industry are always a little fuzzier than the tourism people would make you believe. But here's my kind of idiot's version. All heritage tourists are cultural tourists. There are some cultural tourists that would not be a heritage tourist. So you go to New York and you go to the opera in a new opera house. You're a cultural tourist, you're not a heritage tourist. But my guess is probably 80% of cultural tourists would be heritage tourists. Enough so that statistically we can rely on the numbers. So here's what they've learned about international visitors to the U.S. First of all, they stay in hotels longer than other visitors. There's 470,000 more heritage visitors than go to amusement parks. There are 785,000 more heritage visitors than go to the beach. There are 3 times as many heritage visitors as go to casinos. There are 4 times as many heritage visitors than there are play golf. So if you want to capture that market, it means you have a great opportunity if you focus on heritage tourism. The other thing that's really important about heritage visitors as distinct from tourists in general. International visitors, if they're coming to the U.S. and they're going to one state, it's going to be New York, Florida, or California. It just is. So if the other 47 states of us want any action, we have to find visitors willing to go to more than one state. And that is disproportionately heritage visitors. They are much more likely to go to more than one place than are foreign tourists in general. We did a study in Utah. And of course, Salt Lake City has great resources, but there's also, as most of you probably know, there's great historic resources in small towns like Trinidad spread all around. Now, some of you may be involved in historic sites, in museums, in, you know, whatever historic resources. And here's what your problem is. You go to the city council or the county commission or the state government and you say, can you help us out this year? We're having trouble paying all the light bill. And somebody will say, well, geez, you know, you guys aren't even collecting enough from the people visiting your place to pay your operating expenses. And you kind of go, yeah, that's right. Yeah, but that's not the deal. I first stumbled on this statistic from a guy from Norway who looked at it there, and then I started looking at the U.S. with the same number. And that is in Utah. In these rural historic sites, people went there. The historic site was the magnet that drew them to that town, but that site was not the beneficiary. That site only got about 7% of that tourist expenditure. It was the restaurant, the gas station, the hotel, the car rental place. They got 93% of the money, but it was the heritage site that drew them there. It's kind of like that the really cheap toaster at Target that they're selling for less than they paid for it, but the purpose isn't to make money on the toaster, it's to get you in the store so you buy other stuff. Well, that's really what a lot of historic sites are. They're the magnets that draw those visitors. They don't pay for themselves very frequently, but they don't need to because, in fact, the rest of that local economy is a big beneficiary of those visitors. Then the third is this issue of jobs and household income, this fact of people working on historic buildings are good jobs, they're labor-intensive jobs, and they pay. And they pay disproportionately. We did a study in Connecticut, and we looked at a number of the industries in Connecticut of the jobs created, and these economic models work this way. They start with an output. And an output is a production from a business. And there's like 425 or 30 categories of business. So $1 million of output from a McDonald's, $1 million to a hamburger place, $1 million of output from a lawyer's firm writing wills, $1 million worth of automobile manufacturing. So that's the output. And then based on that, we go through these models and say that much output per million creates this many jobs, this much household income, this whatever. And so we use this model a lot. So $1 million of expenditure in Connecticut on historic rehabilitation, 9 jobs. In Connecticut, we spent $1 million on a new building, 6.7 jobs. If we manufactured steel, 1.4 jobs. If we manufactured computers, 0.9 jobs. If we did medical manufacturing, 1.4. And that's not to dismiss any of those industries. But the fact is that economic development at its heart ought to be about jobs, and historic preservation disproportionately creates the jobs. Now, some industries generate more dollars per, more jobs per $1 million of the income. Like a restaurant will be more jobs per $1 million than that, but they're generally relatively low paid jobs. At the other end, the nuclear power plant has higher income per $1 million, but there's only 4 guys, Homer, Simpson, and 3 others, who are running the power plant. It's this combination of numbers of jobs and income that makes historic preservation so powerful as an economic development tool. Rhode Island, again, had a state tax credit, and their activity has been up and down a lot, and Rhode Island's a state with very little population growth in the last 20 years. I've been very affected by kind of national economic movement, but on average, over the last 15 years, 965 direct jobs a year and another 700 indirect jobs. Well, if you were the state's economic development director and said, legislature, Mr. Governor, Madam Governor, I just recruited an industry that will average 960 jobs a year, my God, you'd get a huge raise in standing ovation. And yet that's on average exactly what historic preservation, using those tax credits in Louisiana, Rhode Island generated. And that has been $50 million in change in paychecks for those people. And this, by the way, is only the income those projects generated in Rhode Island. There's probably some laborers or architects or lawyers from Boston who came down and did the work there. Those numbers aren't reflected here. This is the impact of that on people in Rhode Island. In New York City, we looked at just the investment that takes place in their historic districts, and that means 9,000 jobs. generally, and huge amounts of payroll. Again, you're going to say, what the hell does New York City have to do with Trinidad? Well, in a lot of ground, not much, but I think that there's patterns that are scalable at any level. And here's what happens, you know, a huge real estate industry in New York, and they're building in uptimes, they build a bunch of buildings. When the real estate crashed, starting in 2007 and 2008, the new construction activity ended. It just died in New York City. What happened in the historic districts? They just kept plugging away, investing more, real stable form of economic development. Next here is this issue about property values. And you know, we're such a property rights driven country, and people are so concerned about the value of their homes, that whenever somebody proposes creating a local historic district, there's always a concern about the effect on property values. The interesting thing, however, in the years that I've been doing this, 30 years, is when I started out, the real estate industry, and that's the industry I come from, so I'm not anti-real estate industry, but the real estate industry would often say, we don't want those stupid historic districts, because it's going to mean another layer of regulation. Another layer of regulation means adverse impact on property values. Historic districts are going to lower our property values, therefore we don't want it. Now, the one consistent finding, regardless of who has done it over the last 30 years, is in fact the opposite has been true. In fact, there's enhanced property value, and I'll show you some examples. The last decade, that's not, the argument has changed. The real estate industry is saying, we don't want those stupid historic districts. The property values are going to go up, so our property taxes are going up, so don't get that historic district. Same human beings arguing exactly the opposite. Anyway, great study by a firm of, not my firm, this is a firm of actually smart people, looked at Philadelphia over a long time period. You all know this, but just to put it in context, we have a thing in this country called National Register Districts. They're nice, they're a kind of honorary thing, and for commercial properties, they're the gateway to tax credits, but the National Register provides no protection for historic properties. None, zip, zilch, nada, nothing. The only way historic properties ever have protection is if there is a local historic district. And so what these guys did is looked at what was the value change in local historic districts over this 30-year period in Philadelphia, what was it in National Register districts that were not local districts, and what happened in the rest of the market. And you can see that there was about a 14% premium for National Register districts, and that's kind of people paying for the quality of the neighborhood, and a 20%, 22% increment, preservation premium for being in the local district. Now, I know that we have preservation commissioners here, and I hate to break your heart, but nobody is paying their premium for the privilege of appearing before your goofy commission. They're paying the premium for the confidence that the lunatic across the street can't do something to his house that's going to have an adverse impact on the value of mine. It's that old real estate cliche about three most important things are location, 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 really is true. That real estate, a given piece of real estate, does not get its economic value from inside those four lot lines. Real estate gets its value from its context. And that's the economic role of kind of land use planning in general, but historic districts in particular, is protecting the context within which that individual property exists, and it pays off in a premium. One of the best studies in the U.S. was done by a professor at University of Louisville, very sophisticated linear regression, hedonic pricing method, where he looked at the differences that property A sold for from property B, and accounted for all of the differences, different size, different age, different condition, did it have a garage, did it have a third bathroom, whatever, all the differences, so there was only one difference left. It was in or it was not in a local historic district. And this is what he found, that over this 8-year period he looked, that those historic district properties improved in value about $60,000 more than the market, and they went up 21% in appreciation over that time period. So that really, the premium of protection. Here is San Antonio. In San Antonio, they have local historic districts. They also have a thing called conservation districts. Some people dismiss them as preservation light. I think that they're very appropriate sometimes. But they are kind of districts of protection, but with a little less aggressive design ordinances. And so we looked at, over this period from 98 to 2013, the change in value in local historic districts, conservation districts and the rest of the neighborhoods. Keep in mind that what this period covered is kind of lunatic appreciation of real estate, big crash of real estate, and then a period of gradual recovery. And it didn't matter which cycle, the ones that did the best were the local historic districts. The ones that did the second best were the conservation districts, both of which did better than the rest of the market. Here is the town of Canton, Connecticut. That's about, I don't know, 40 or 50 miles northwest of Hartford, the capital. And there's the boundaries of the town. The pink area is a National Register district. Within the National District, there's a local district. So a third maybe of the National Register district is also a local district, but the only one with protection is in the local district. So you see over this period, values up 32% in the local district, 28% in the National Register district, 22% in the rest of the town. Here is Savannah, one of the great historic cities, of course, in America. And we looked at the change from 99 to 2014. Again, this reflects the crazy up, the crazy down, and then the gradual recovery. So here's the market. And here is how they changed in value over that 15-year period. Again, all of the local districts outperformed the city as a whole. Some of those are very wealthy districts. Some of them are the opposite of wealthy districts. Didn't matter. They all outperformed the market. Here is all of the National Register districts in Savannah. Again, all of them but one outperformed the market as a whole. Here is Indianapolis with the same answer. Every one of their historic districts doing better than the city as a whole. So this is really a consistent pattern. It doesn't matter who looks at it, methodology, what city. Historic districts do better in the ups and downs. So those were the big four. Downtown revitalization, jobs and household income, heritage tourism, property values. Well, as we've looked more places, we've come up with the new 10. Foreclosure, stability on the downside, density, walkability. I'll go through them all and give you some factoids from some of these studies we've done. So we have looked now in about 20 cities at the foreclosure, patterns of foreclosure in the Great Recession. And again, this was horrible. Many of you were probably affected. Horrible that people lost their entire asset base because the real estate market went to hell. They couldn't get a loan and they couldn't sell a house. In every case we've looked at, the foreclosure patterns in the local historic districts were a third to a half of that in the market as a whole. That was true in 5 cities in Utah. Here it is in the city of Raleigh, where the whole city, almost 1 in 10 properties, went into some kind of foreclosure action. That was a third of that in the local historic districts. Here is in San Antonio. Every historic district had lower rates of foreclosure than the city as a whole. And here's the reason I think. It's not that people who live in historic districts never get fired, never get divorced, never run the credit card bills up too much. I think here's what's happening, is that in a weak market, that there is still a sufficient latent demand for properties in those neighborhoods, that if I get in financial trouble, I can get that property sold before it gets to that foreclosure process. Not that property values didn't go down, they did, but there were vastly fewer foreclosures. Somebody ought to be paying attention. HUD, the Mortgage Bankers Association, the National Association of Realtors, the bankers, this is a big deal, statistically significant deal, hugely. So if risk and reward are the patterns of banking, we ought to be getting better loans in the historic district because the likelihood of foreclosure is significantly less. Next one is kind of stability on the downside. So here is Savannah. The historic districts outperformed the market as a whole in the up years. And in the down years, the decline started later, went down shallower, recovered sooner. And again, we just picked Savannah, but it's a pattern we found everywhere we looked. Then the issue of density. Density is a weird thing because planners say we need to have density. Lots of environmentalists will say we have to have density. The city finance guy says we have to have density to make the public transportation, the sewer system. We want density. Everybody likes density except the population who says, if I want density, I move to New York. I don't want that damn density stuff. Okay, understand. So we looked, and here's the city of Raleigh. At the beginning of the 20th century, they had populations in Raleigh approaching 8,000 people per square mile. And then as the automobile came and living patterns spread out, the density fell way down. And so now the density in the city of Raleigh, about 2,500 people per square mile. Here's the local historic districts at twice that amount, at 54, all historic districts at 46. Well, what this is density at a human scale. In fact, you're getting density. You're getting huge amounts of density, but you're getting it not because you built 40-story condos. You did because you have lot sizes, building coverage, a whole pattern of how neighborhoods were built for the first, all of the 19th century and the first, half of the 20th century, and a pattern that created natural density, and it's just showing up. And I'll show you some more examples of that. I happen to be politically on the side of the equation that says we should try to be frugal with taxpayers' money. You may or may not be that, but that's how I am. And so I often look for ways that we measure this fiscal consequence of decisions, planning decisions, land use patterns. So we were looking at Raleigh, and I have a very smart young woman who works for me, Bree Grosicki, and I said, here's what I want you to do. We want you to find me 2 neighborhoods that are the same size, but one is a relatively new subdivision and another historic district. That's all I care about, that they're the same size, and we're going to look at a bunch of measures. So she found 2, Oakwood, which is a historic district, and Reedham Oaks Wyndham, which is a newer subdivision. Both of them 114 acres, the same size. Housing units, about 800 in Oakwood, 177 or 127 in Reedham. Year of construction, average year of construction, 1925 in Oakwood, 1992. So that was it. And that is our base. We started looking stuff. So average square house, suite per house, about 2,500 in the historic district, about 3,500 in the subdivision. That's fine. You can keep some bigger houses, nothing wrong with that. Average value, $325,000 in the historic district, 500 and some in the Oakwood, so big, more expensive houses. Taxes per unit, $2,900 in Oakwood, $4,800 in Wyndham. This is where prematurely the city finance guy said, yeah, so that's why I like those. I don't like those stupid old historic districts. We're getting the money. Okay, just chill for a minute, Mr. Finance guy. Population per acre, 14.5 in the historic district, 4 in new subdivision. Square foot of road per unit. Now, just remember that roads are something that ultimately are public responsibility. Even if the developer puts in their initial roads, the road's got to be there forever, and that's a taxpayer's cost. So we have about 1,100 square feet of road per unit in the historic district, 2,300 in the new subdivision. Taxes per acre, 22,000 in Oakwood, 5,300 in Reedham, and many public costs. Certainly roads, certainly sidewalks, certainly street lights, certainly the miles that the police car and the ambulance have to drive are driven by area. And when you have fewer people, that's why the argument for density, when you have fewer people, it means there's this greater per police call, per whatever cost because of that sheer distance. Water and sewer lines, they got to be replaced periodically. The per unit replacement cost, $8,800 in the historic district, $24,000 in the new subdivision, and annual property taxes, $2.2 million from Oakwood, $631,000. Where's helping the city's budget in these 2 neighborhoods? Then New York City, and the real estate industry in New York City is on a tear to weaken preservation laws. And their argument is this: we're fixed in boundaries. We cannot grow. We can't grow. There's no way to change the boundaries. The only way we can grow is grow up. We're growing in population, so we have to add density, and we're having a housing cost crisis. The only way we're going to resolve that is add a bunch of density by building high rises, and in those stupid historic districts, they're not letting us build those high rises in the historic districts. We got to weaken those laws. That's their kind of basic argument. So we looked at all the residential skyscrapers that were built in Manhattan since 2001 or 2002. And we looked at the census tract where they exist and looked at the change in density. And it was, they were right, it was huge. There was 9,700 people per square mile, went up to 104,000 people. So yeah, they added a bunch of density. And then we looked at the historic districts. The historic districts were already 144,000 per square mile at a human scale, 4- or 5-story townhouses. And because the nature of how they were also, if you have to add density in there, no question. But why in the hell do you think you have to add it in the neighborhoods where they're already? And that was true, by the way, in all 5 boroughs of New York. Didn't matter, the magnitude changed, but in every one of the 5 boroughs, the most dense residential neighborhoods were the historic districts. Then this issue of walkability, that's become really important in terms of real estate values, in terms of public policy, in terms of public health, in terms of planning. So we looked at where the historic tax credit had been used in Connecticut as a kind of proxy for the walkability. Yeah, you all know, you should know, hopefully you know, but there's a thing called walkscore.com. And you go on the internet, go to walkscore.com, type in any address in America, and you'll get a walk score from 1 to 100. And the higher the walk score, the more walkable it becomes. So, 2/3 of these were in the very walkable areas. And when you think about historic neighborhoods, in fact, that's what they are. So this is not like the historic district made it. It's the nature of historic neighborhoods make them walkable places. We looked at all of the historic districts in San Antonio, and all but one had better walkability scores than the city as a whole. Here is Raleigh. The city as a whole only gets a score of 29, a very automobile-dependent city. Local historic districts, 82. Then this issue about catalyst is that what happens, so somebody does a historic rehabilitation project, what happens around it? Well, the lieutenant governor, happens to be a Republican lieutenant governor in Louisiana. And Louisiana, of course, is facing really tough economic decisions. There had been 2 studies in Louisiana on the impact of historic preservation, this tax credit project. But the lieutenant governor said, okay, we got those numbers, but we need to know 2 things. We need to know the human side of that story, and we need to know what those projects triggered around it. And so we looked in 5 or 6 cities in Louisiana. So here's Baton Rouge. I don't know if you've ever been there, but I was there, the last time maybe 10 years ago, and now last year. It's a different place, mostly because of the downtown, and the downtown has changed its face entirely because of the historic tax credit projects. And they began small and grew up. It's again kind of trickle up development. And Dana can tell you that the real estate industry likes to present themselves as the kind of big 21st century merchant princes taking big risks. They really want to be risk averse. They want to take as little risk as possible. So it's a very common pattern that the little projects, some idiot doesn't know what he's doing, does a little project and it works. And then it kind of makes sense to do bigger and bigger projects because the risk kind of factor has changed. Risk can be mitigated. Here's my favorite of all. That white building that you see in the bottom right-hand thing is a former automobile dealership. It's not some great New York or New Orleans thing with balconies on it. It was a 1940s or 1950s automobile dealership that was converted into a market, a grocery store market. Fabulous thing. Using the tax credits, was on the National Register. And look at from Katrina until 2012, 0 happened in that neighborhood. 0! The Star is where this project took place, and look at what happened. $140 million investment in that immediate area. Like at 500 square feet, or 500 feet around this area, $140 million investment. Much of it in new construction, it was just vacant lots. But clearly, every developer, rehabilitation and new construction, the reason that we were able to do our project is because that guy proved it could work with the rehabilitation of a 1950s automobile dealership. Savannah has a college, the Savannah College of Art and Design, and they've kind of taken an interesting approach. Instead of building a campus, they've seen the city as their campus, and they have for 30 years bought every white elephant building that nobody wanted. A theater, an empty department store, the jail, the armory, the schoolhouse, they bought them all. And so we looked at what happened, and they were in isolation. They're not in the campus, they were scattered all around. And so we looked at what happened to the property values around the SCAD investments. So there was the projects that they did between 1999, and there's the ones that they did between 1999 and 2004, and 2005 and 9, and after 2014. Every time what that project did. They invested in the armory of the school, but in fact, it enhanced the value of the properties all around them. Dana and I were talking on the way down from Denver about the opportunity in many upper floors in Trinidad to add housing. I am the world's #1 fan of upper floor housing. It works, it works, it works, it works. I used to have the 1 to 3% crazy person rule, and that is any town of any size and any economic condition, any place in America, something between 1 and 3% of the population will live right downtown in upper floors if quality housing is available. So you have 10,000 people, so I'm telling you that means right this instant, there's 100 to 300 people willing to move in upper floor housing in downtown Trinidad this minute, where quality housing is available. So we've then taken a step further and say, all right, what happens? What happens if somebody moves into those, and our hypothesis was a couple, moves into one of these upper housing units and they pay their rent, and we did this, I think, in Michigan, and we looked, and there's a great variety of rental rates. If the goods, somebody has a cheap apartment, $400 a month, they will add, in addition to their rent, they'll spend almost $8,000 right in the downtown. If the goods and services are available. If they're paying rents more like here, they're paying $800 a month, they're going to spend $11,000 right in the downtown area if goods and services. And we're very conservative about this. And what we did is back in based on, can predict what their income was, based on the rent they're paying, and based on their income, we can predict what they're going to spend. So it's this huge economic generator of having housing in upper floors of downtown. Yet, whatever you have here, it's not enough. Whatever you have, there's more opportunity just waiting to be taken advantage of. Then there's this disproportionate draw of historic buildings to workers in the knowledge and creative industries. North Carolina, in their state economic development strategy, said we need to increase this attraction in the arts, entertainment, and recreation kind of creative class workers. Now the sheer numbers in that class will never be huge numbers, but they fight above their weight class. They really do a lot to local economies. That's why I'm so excited. This is a fabulous, fabulous, fabulous project with artists loft housing and going across the street. But anyway, so in North Carolina, less than 2% of the jobs were in this category. Raleigh, such it is, was more. National Register districts more. And then local historic districts, twice as much of the likelihood of people in those industries being in the historic district than being in the state as a whole. Here is Savannah. They're 30% of all jobs in historic district, but here's the kind of knowledge workers, all disproportionately in the historic districts. Here is New York City. In New York City, 8% of all of the jobs are in local historic districts. Look at the end one. Here's a capital culture of the world, and 20% of those jobs are in historic districts. And historic districts, by the way, only make up about 4% of all the lots in New York City. And yet 20% of the jobs in arts, entertainment are in those districts. Can't tell me there's not a synergism between the creative types in the arts and historic buildings. And furthermore, the job growth, not only those industries large in New York City, but they have a greater propensity to be growing in those areas, meaning, in fact, more demand in those historic districts. Here's another, some of you, those that were there this morning heard this routine on this before, but one of the data points that the federal government collects in any year, how many businesses begin and how many end. So it's this ratio between business growths and business deaths. And over the long haul, that ratio tends to be something between 1.1 and 1.2 to 1, meaning 11 or 12 businesses start for every 10 that close. And of course, you have to have more opening than closing, or you're going to have a declining economy. So here in the kind of recession, pre-recession, recession years in the country. So you had, in 2004, 5, 6, you had kind of at the 1.1, 1.2 growth in more business openings and closing. You get to 2007. The end of 2007 was the beginning of the recession, and started the kind of forewarning we're going to have trouble. And then 2008, 2009, 2010, you had more businesses closing than opening, reflecting that declining economy. And then by 2011, it kind of get back up to normal. So you can see what's happening in the nation. So we've now looked at, I don't know, 6 of them, but here's the data on 3 of the Main Street states. Every one of them, in Michigan, North Carolina, and New Mexico, 3 dramatically different state economies, didn't matter. In these Main Street communities in all 3 of those states, this ratio of people opening up to closing was significantly better than would have been dictated by the national trends. That is because they've used Main Street to create an economic environment for people to open businesses, for people to stay in business when times are tough. We need, I guess, to have Googles and Amazons and General Motors, but I'm a market capitalist guy, but I'm really a small firm believer. And I think that 80% of the businesses in America are employ fewer than 20 people. I think that's really the backbone of our economy, not the giants. And so we look at where the small businesses, startup businesses, where they choose. Here's New York City, and expensive rents. It's tough for a small business or startup business. So 3.4% of the lots in New York City are in historic districts, 8% of the private sector jobs, 10% of the small firm jobs, 10% of the smart startup firms, 11% of the young firms meaning starting within the last 5 years. So again, a disproportionate draw of those historic districts to small firms and startup firms. We have a kind of philosophical position in our firm, and you're under no obligation to accept it, it's just ours, and that is that we're a very diverse country, and we ought to have diversity represented at the neighborhood level. And that ought to be diversity racially, ought to be diversity ethnically, it ought to be diversity of age, and it ought to be diversity of income. We really believe that that a neighborhood ought to be a mirror of the demographics of the city as a whole. You're not obligated to agree with this, that's just kind of our position. So, but it's something we've looked at a lot. So here is San Antonio. And we've looked at household income in the historic districts and the city as a whole, and largely the lines are just parallel with these exceptions at the ends. That the historic districts have more people at the bottom end of the economic spectrum and a few more at the top in historic districts. Well, to me, that's nothing but good news to have rich people live next to poor people. I think that helps everybody. But the fact is, the income, they're really distributed. The city as a whole, by income, is reflected in the historic districts. Then we looked at race. Well, again, it's virtually the same numbers. The only trouble with this is there's a very relatively small African-American population in San Antonio. So the numbers are pretty consistent. The African-American population, 6.9% of the city as a whole, 6.8 of those who live in the historic district. It's just not a very big number. The more significant distribution in San Antonio is the Hispanic population. And again, it's the same number. Is that 63% of the population in San Antonio is Hispanic, and 60% of who lives in historic districts is Hispanic. So there's skew sometimes from one neighborhood to another, but on an aggregate basis, who lives in the historic district is who lives in the city. Here in Rhode Island, we looked, and we had to recheck the numbers because I thought we must have made them up. They were so consistent. So here is the distribution by income in historic districts in the state of Rhode Island. Same distribution. Here's distribution by race in Rhode Island. Same distribution. Who's living in the historic district is who's living in the state. The one population area that has grown in Rhode Island in the last 15 years is the Hispanic population. And you can see what's happened is that the share of Hispanic population in historic districts has grown as a share as the population of Hispanic population, the population of the whole state has grown. Then there's this issue of the environment. Great study in Maryland by an environmental economist and an investment banker. And here was their model. They were looking at their state tax credits. They say, here's our choice. We can take an existing 50,000 square foot warehouse, rehabilitate it, put it into use, or we can go at the edge of town and build a new 50,000 square foot warehouse. When we're done, each case just represents a 50,000 square foot warehouse. What would be the environmental differences in those two choices? And you can see them. 20 to 40% reduction in vehicle miles traveled, reduction of CO2 emissions, saved in construction in the use of gasoline, the embodied energy in those buildings of 55,000 million BTUs, saved land 5.2 acres, less construction debris by 2,500 tons, infrastructure investment saved $500,000 to $800,000. So whether you're looking at the economy or the environment, in fact, huge difference in those simple choices being made of where do we build and what do we do. I mentioned this morning that I think that the Tea Party and the Sierra Club ought to be holding hands leading the preservation parade, because it's both this incredibly environmental difference, but it's also this huge difference in kind of fiscal and local economic responsibility. One of the good things that National Trust has done in the last few years is this Preservation Greenland. It's done very good, robust, peer-reviewed research on energy efficiency of buildings. And in their model, they looked at 3 building typologies in 3 different parts of the country, and looked at the differences between doing the rehabilitation of existing buildings, so it's energy efficient, but rehabilitation, or do some kind of green gizmo razzle-dazzle thing. And their discovery is that it takes from 10 to 80 years to recover the environmental cost that building a new building cost. And those buildings aren't going to last 80 years. And that in almost every building typology in every region, in fact, it was more environmentally sound to rehab the existing building than to build a new one. New York City, Mayor Bloomberg, before he went out as mayor, wanted to put New York on the path to be the most energy efficient country in the city in the world. And he's a good businessman, so he said, step one, we have to see where we are now. And so they did huge energy audits of tens of thousands of buildings. And here's what they learned, is that contrary to what environmentalists have been telling us for 30 years, you gotta tear down those old things because they're big energy hogs, that in fact, the least use of energy per square foot were buildings built prior to 1920. And every decade that went further, they're using more energy, not less, per square foot. Energy savings is really in the old historic buildings. Apologize to those of you who heard me go through this earlier today, but in the study in Utah, we hired a guy, a professor at the University of Utah, who was an engineer, who likes to do measurements. And so he created this model of materials flow, that when you build something, you got to get something out of the ground or cut it from the forest. You got to get a raw material. You got to convert it into a building material. You have to haul it someplace. You have to incorporate it into a building. You got to use the building for some finite life, and then you throw stuff away or do something else. So, and each one of which has an energy cost. And so he measured all of these energy costs using 3 alternatives. He said, what if we take a small house and kind of energy retrofit it so it's very energy efficient but historically appropriate? What if we go at the edge of town and build a new building of the same size? Or what if we tear down the existing building and replace it with a new green gizmo building? Vastly different amounts of this materials flow over the life of the building. That's what being sustainable is about. Every time they have a state tax credit that you can use for residences in Utah. Average house size that they used the tax credit was about 2,200 square feet. And that saved, because they renovated instead of raised it, that saved 116 tons of stuff going into the landfill. Maybe this has some my data is going to be from large cities, but maybe there's some applicability to Trinidad. And that is this issue of the first place of return. I live in Washington, D.C. I teach class in the spring in Philadelphia, both of which were cities that declined in population for 50 years. I wanted to look at what happened when cities with long-term population decline turned the corner and started growing again, where that growth happened. So we looked at Philadelphia. I remember, as I go up there every Tuesday morning in the spring, I remember the big headline, we finally turned the corner. We didn't grow much, it was only 4,500 people, but we grew in population after 50 years of decline. We grew in population in Philadelphia, except they didn't. The historic districts grew by 12,000 people. The rest of the city still lost population. When people begin to return, the first place they return is the historic neighborhoods in those cities. Here's Washington, where I live. Again, 50 years of decline, in the 2000, between 2000 and 2010, it began to grow again. So 45% of us live in historic districts, 62% of the growth occurred in those historic districts. Here's Boston, who turned the corner a decade earlier, started growing again. Where did it go? Is that 22% of the population lives in historic districts, 36% of the growth that took place in the historic districts. So if you've declined in population and you want to grow again, for God's sake, don't be tearing down this stuff. It will be the first place of return when people start coming back. Here's Rhode Island, a state that's been flat in population growth. We looked at their tax credit projects, and we looked within the census block within which those tax credit projects took place. Between 2000 and 2010, the state population grew less than 0.5% population growth around these projects, 16%. That's where the people gathered. That's a catalytic impact. In the population overall, between 2000 and 2015, 12% of the state's population lives in historic districts, but 56% of the growth in population in Rhode Island took place in those historic districts. It's not a statistical fluke. It's a stated preference. There's a concept in economics called revealed preference. We could ask all of you, do you like chocolate ice cream, do you like vanilla ice cream, and you raise your hand in one or the other. Or we can take a tray of ice cream with both around, and some chocolate, some of you will take chocolate, some will take vanilla. And that's revealed preference. We know what you like based on your action. Well, this is revealed preference. Clearly the population grew in the areas that they wanted to be in, and that was local historic districts. So 30 years now of this data, lessons being learned, and what's interesting is every year we're learning more ways that the historic preservation positively affects local communities and local economies. Thank you all very much. So, do you want to take a quick question or two, or save all those for tomorrow?
Save those for tomorrow.
Say, okay, great. All the better. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much. We want to also invite you to breakfast in the morning at the Holiday Inn. It'll be from 8 to 9:30, and we're going to do a round table. So Donovan will be addressing all of your questions tomorrow at breakfast. Yes, John?
Yeah, I'm John Tarabino, and my brother and I are the owners of the building and whatnot, and I'd just like to thank all of you for coming and listening to this, because it really works. You know, it's far better than having an empty building and no one and all the rest of it. It takes time, it takes cooperation, it takes a lot of interaction to make this kind of thing happen. We've got another building just down in the next block that used to be in Montgomery Ward. This used to be adjacent Penny. And we converted that over sort of a similar type of fashion and whatnot. And we've got a series of, I guess probably about 8 mini stores in there with a variety of different kind of things, clothing stores and so on and so forth. But the point is, the building is occupied. Occupancy means you've got people coming in, you've got people selling and having jobs and so on and so forth. And it takes some risks. You have to be willing to stick your neck out just a little bit. And you may not be an ideal place for this kind of thing for everybody, but it's working for us and our family, and it's far better than everything conservative and so on and so forth. So just, very much supportive of historic preservation and all the things that come along with it.
Thanks, John. So for those of you that traveled, thank you so much for coming to Trinidad and sharing this experience with us. We'd love for you to come up, and we'd love to recommend some restaurants to you this evening. We hope that you're available to stay overnight and join us for breakfast and do a roundtable discussion with Donovan. If you're not able to stay over, maybe we could hang around for a second so you could have some one-on-one time to ask him some questions. I think in closing from the city, we just want to thank our citizen volunteers that sit on our creative district, our Main Street, our Planning and Zoning Variance Commission, our Urban Renewal, and our Historic Preservation Commission. Every single one of those initiatives has historic preservation and our historic architecture at the core. It's in the comprehensive plan, it's in the urban renewal plan, and it's something we've prioritized. I especially want to thank our city council, the city council we have right now, as well as the several previous city councils who really began to address historic preservation in a major way several years ago. I think that's laid the groundwork for us for a lot of the revitalization that you're seeing. And lastly, I want to say our city manager who joined us 10 months ago, it was refreshing when he came in to meet with staff the very first time and really prioritized historic preservation as one of the things he understood at the basis of economic development. So we hope that you enjoy our town. We hope that you see what's going on and you know that it's taken a lot of staff, a lot of appointed officials, and especially a lot of elected officials to really commit to the revitalization of Trinidad along those lines. Finally, we want to thank Dana for always being a champion for us and working with us to develop these types of events. And Donovan, thank you for joining us. So, Mayor, unless you wanted to say anything in closing, I think we're done. Okay, so if you don't know where to eat, come talk to us.